The Ukrainian Shahed is now a reality. Ukraine has unveiled its deadly miracle drone, more powerful, faster, and smarter than its Iranian counterparts. Ukrainian Armed Forces engineers have created a next-generation strike UAV that is already ready to hunt the enemy. What can this UAV do, and why is the enemy already in a panic? Details coming up.
The Ukrainian Shahed is no longer a fantasy or just a public demand for Ukrainian developers. Now it is a reality called the Batyar UAV. Engineers say that just 6 months ago it existed only on paper. Today it is a fully functional drone that has passed testing and is ready for mass production. Today Ukraine holds a leading position in drone production worldwide. No other country in the world produces more drones than Ukraine. We produce more than China, and we manufacture them using localized Ukrainian components. It is known that the Batyar drone has a range of 800 kilometers. By the way, that's farther than the distance, say, to Krasnodar, Voronezh, Volgograd, or Saratov. And of course, it easily covers the distance to Moscow. Initially, the drone was conceived as a strike kamikaze UAV for long-range attacks. However, during development, the Ukrainian Shahed was made universal.
We can use the same drone as a decoy, a bomber, or as a frontline kamikaze drone. It all depends on what payload we put on it and what software we use.
It's almost impossible not to notice that the drone itself looks and functions very much like a Shahed. And the designers don't hide the fact that they use the Iranian development as a basis. However, the components have been replaced with Ukrainian and Western ones.
If we're talking specifically about this drone, yes, it's smaller, but it looks very similar to the Iranian Shahed because of the wing geometry and certain design features. In Russia, they just stick on a label. And when we talk about its future use, basically this drone can effectively hit targets located at that kind of distance.
Among the known characteristics is also the drone's warhead. Here, however, it is several times inferior to the original Shaheds modified by the Russians, 18 kilograms versus 50, and in some cases even 90 kilograms. However, experts say that Ukraine developed this weapon not against civilians, but against military targets. And for such tasks, this warhead is more than sufficient.
Not a single Shahed has reached a military target throughout the entire full-scale war. It has always been a weapon of terror, specifically intended to disrupt our lives. Accordingly, when we develop any equipment, we immediately state that Ukrainian engineers design it to target the enemy's military infrastructure.
One of the main tasks the developers recall was to create a lightweight drone. By the way, the Batyar ended up weighing only 60 kilograms. It was also important that the UAV could be launched from a catapult or a vehicle to avoid bulky launch systems. They managed to achieve this as well. However, the developers consider its guidance system to be its standout feature. It is claimed that when diving steeply toward a target, the drone is able to stay on course and strike precisely at the designated coordinates, even if it has been damaged. At the same time, it is known that Batyar is far from the only Ukrainian analog of the Shahed. Naturally, not all developments are revealed to the general public. However, the number of drones of this type in the Ukrainian Armed Forces will soon increase significantly.
Currently, about 5 to 10 different manufacturers have presented their drones, which, in terms of specifications, are actually quite close to, or at least comparable with, the Shahed drones, both in terms of operational flight range and the types of munitions they can use.
As for those critics who complain about the smaller warhead of the Batyar compared to the Russian Shaheds, it's important to understand that Ukraine is not repeating Russia's approach by fixating on upgrading a single type of drone. For different tasks, the defense forces use different types of drones, including ones with much larger warheads. And importantly, these are also produced in Ukraine.
As of today, when it comes to Ukrainian drones, the range of models has now surpassed 100 units.
And the principle followed by our engineers, to make things simpler but in greater numbers, allows us to produce domestic drones not just by the thousands, but by the hundreds of thousands each month. The same fate awaits the Batyar UAV.
Urgent! A swarm of Ukrainian drones has broken into Tatarstan. The Ukrainian Armed Forces are bringing the war onto enemy territory. The most important targets have been reduced to dust. The Kremlin is preparing thousands of drones and hundreds of ballistic missiles. The beginning of the apocalypse is near. Ukraine is taking to the skies. All F-16 fighters are already in service. A strike against Putin's air force. Putin was hit by drones while at a resort. The Russian Ministry of Defense is making up new stories, but the truth has come out. Watch for all the details.
It's very loud in Russia again. Drones have visited various regions of the country.
He went into the forest.
He went.
It turned out to be a factory in the city of Yelabuga where Russians produce Shahed-type drones.
They were hitting the factory itself.
Right on the factory!
This military factory was built in 2023 in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone for large-scale production of the Russian version of the Iranian Shahed 136 strike drone. In the Russian version, it is known as the Geren 2. It should be noted that according to estimates by Western and domestic intelligence services, the production capacity is up to 6,000 units per year.
Russians also complained about a drone attack in the Ivanovo region. The drones attacked a large chemical plant that produces components for occupation equipment and weapons, including missiles.
At the plant, right?
According to open sources, this enterprise is used in the production chain for manufacturing explosives, meaning it is affiliated with the Russian Federation's military-industrial complex. Therefore, once again, attacks on the territory of this enterprise are not accidental, and they are a legitimate military target for Ukraine's defense forces and intelligence community.
The aggressor country also continues massive attacks on civilian facilities in Ukraine. Since January 2025, the occupiers have carried out 7 of the largest missile and drone attacks since the beginning of the full-scale war. Against the backdrop of failures at the front, the Russian dictator is using strikes on Ukrainian cities and aggressive rhetorical campaigns to undermine the morale of Ukrainians and to convince the West that a Russian victory is inevitable, analysts at the Institute for the Study of War write.
Putin is trying to exert informational and military political pressure not only on the leadership of Ukraine, but also accordingly on the United States. This refers to the ultimatum from the Russian side, namely the withdrawal of Ukrainian Defense Force units from the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson regions that are under their control. It is noteworthy that the escalation along the line of contact coincides with large-scale attacks by Russian UAVs on peaceful Ukrainian cities. Moreover, the geography of these strikes covers virtually the entire territory of Ukraine.
Just a year ago, 30 attack drones striking Ukraine in a single night would have been considered something extraordinary. But on May 25, 2025, the occupiers deployed around 300 drones, which is likely a record number. The Economist suggests that Russian attacks against Ukraine using 1,000 strike UAVs could become a reality.
The information presented in The Economist about the capabilities of the Russian military-industrial complex is exaggerated. The latest strikes by Ukrainian drones have specifically targeted enterprises involved in the production of Russian strike systems, namely UAVs and ballistic strike systems. Let me remind you, these are the factories in Yelabuga. There's also the Yelts plant, which produced batteries for unmanned aerial vehicles, and accordingly strikes on other production facilities of the Russian Federation's military-industrial complex.
The Netherlands, meanwhile, will send Ukraine the final batch of F-16 fighter jets from the previously promised 24 aircraft. This will significantly help the armed forces of Ukraine fight against the occupying troops.
As an element of the air defense system, primarily at the moment of repelling attacks by the Russian Federation using aeroballistic and aerodynamic means of destruction, that is, for destroying Russian drones and accordingly cruise and ballistic missiles. This experience has already been significantly expanded and scaled up by the Ukrainian Defense Forces, and this is in particular a priority in the use of the F-16.
Meanwhile, Russian propagandists are spreading yet another fake. Allegedly, helicopters of the Kremlin dictator came under attack by the Ukrainian Armed Forces during his trip to the Kursk region. And Putin supposedly ended up right in the epicenter of repelling a massive strike.
This is nothing more than an attempt by the Russian side to portray the Russian dictator as a hero in the eyes of the Russian public. They are well aware that the results of the visit to the Kursk region, which were supposed to highlight the complete control of the political and military leadership over the situation, have completely failed against the backdrop of successful counterattacks by the Ukrainian Defense Forces in the Kursk, Belgorod, and accordingly Bryansk regions.
For context, at the moment of the UAV attack, Russia announces the cover plan, meaning a complete closure of the airspace to all aircraft.
In the Chasiv Yar area, an assault by Russians using motorcycles and Tiger armored vehicles was repelled. Ukrainian soldiers noted that some of the enemy's equipment was destroyed while still on the move, and almost the entire landing group was eliminated. The occupiers' attack failed. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, a total of 4 Russian assaults were repelled in the Kramatorsk direction, 2 in the Pridniprovska area, 3 each in the Kharkiv, Siversk, and Orikiv directions, and 5 in the Toretsk direction. Ukrainian soldiers stopped the most Russian attacks in the Pokrovsk direction. Since the beginning of the day, the occupiers have made 30 unsuccessful attempts there to push the defenders from their positions. As noted by the General Staff, the enemy's losses are being clarified.
I'll put it this way. In our sector, especially in the Pokrovsk direction, yes, that's what I'm talking about now, equipment is hardly being used and heavy armored vehicles are not being used at all. That's how it is. Sometimes, let's say once or twice a month, they try to use it in an attempt to break through somewhere or bypass our positions, but whenever equipment appears, it immediately draws close attention. And in the shortest possible time, it is either destroyed or, if damaged, pulled back. Here. So now, for the most part, assaults are carried out using only motorcycles.
In addition, in the Lyman direction, Ukrainian soldiers repelled 12 attacks by the invading army, successfully stopping all enemy attempts to advance. Another 16 assaults were repelled on the Novopavlivka section of the front.
In the Novopavlivka direction,
the enemy tried to break through the defenses of our defenders near Konstantinopil, Vesele, Bohatir, Shevchenko, and Odryadne. The enemy attacks were successfully repelled. On the temporarily occupied territory of the Zaporizhzhia region, a military cargo train belonging to the Russian occupiers was destroyed. Spectacular footage of the combat operation was published by the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. The soldiers note that precise strikes on the occupiers' logistics facility were carried out while the train was in motion. Railway supply lines for the Russian occupation forces in the temporarily occupied territories of the Zaporizhzhia region and Crimea have been disrupted. The armed struggle aimed at hindering and paralyzing the military logistics of the Russian Federation's army continues. From the statement of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Telegram. FPV drone operators destroyed the launch site of Russian drone operators in the Kursk direction. Aerial reconnaissance detected it precisely at the moment when the Russian UAVs were coming into land, and almost immediately a targeted strike was carried out there. The soldiers note that they continue to search for new targets.
FPV, yes, but...
FPV, yes, it stops vehicles and infantry. With a bomber, you can attach a big bomb which can, well, you can blow up a dugout, and that's awesome. These are mainly dugouts, as well as delivering food to our guys, and also infantry. If they show up somewhere, they go there. On the Kursk section of the front, since the beginning of the day, Ukrainian defense forces have repelled 14 attacks by the Russian army. There is also information that the Kremlin has transferred additional units to the Kursk region, including the 44th Army Corps of the Leningrad Military District. Analysts note that this is very telling.
This indicates that the operational reserves of the Russian troops from the Bryansk and Belgorod operational tactical groupings, whose total number is about 100,000, are already insufficient to attempt to hold back the Ukrainian advance in the territories of the Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod region.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now. Putin has conceived something insane. A sudden decree. The dictator demands to seize a buffer zone along the entire border with Ukraine. What is really behind the new order from the bunker dweller? We reveal all the details of the Kremlin's audacious plan. You will be shocked by the scale of the scheme. Watch.
This speech by the bunker dweller became clear proof that Putin has no intention of stopping when it comes to a ceasefire or further occupation of Ukraine.
a decision was made to create the necessary security buffer zone along the border. Our armed forces are currently working to accomplish this task.
In fact, in his latest speech, the bunker actually announced new goals for the SVO.
Putin has announced new objectives for the special military operation. So it's no longer about taking Kiev in 3 days. It's no longer about territorial realities, borders, or the Donetsk and so on regions. Now it's about creating a buffer zone.
Thus, according to military analysts, the Kremlin is sending a clear signal to the United States and the West that Ukraine must give up at least 2 more of its regions.
The idea of a buffer zone, this is also an element of dialogue with the American partners. This is a continuation of the policy, not for 5 regions, but for 6 to 8 regions. We will see 6 to 8 regions. And it's important to understand that Russia, right now, will need to somehow justify to its own society, including in terms of the legal status of its servicemen from the perspective of internal Russian legislation, why Russian soldiers are present in the territory of Sumy region, for example. Why are they there, after all? Or in Kharkiv region, you see? After all, these regions have not been declared by Russia as its own. There were no so-called referendums there. That is, Russia does not formally or legally claim them.
Such legalization of Putin's new territorial claims defies both logic and criticism. The bunker dweller could secure his own border with Ukraine in a matter of days. He just needs to withdraw troops from our territory.
The sheer idiocy of this decision lies in the fact that before February 24, 2022, there were no problems at all in the Russian regions bordering Ukraine. Not in Belgorod, not in Kursk, not in Voronezh, nor in Rostov regions.
To be honest, even the Moscow region would be sleeping much more peacefully without this so-called special military operation, as it has recently been regularly suffering from drone attacks. However, the bunker dweller is not looking for a solution to the problem. On the contrary, experts say he is desperately trying to unleash an even more bloody war.
This so-called buffer zone, in my personal opinion, or rather from my perspective, is, well, you see, this kind of decision clearly shows that Putin intends to continue the war for as long as he remains in power.
To create a smokescreen, Putin publicly tasked his generals with developing a plan to establish a 30-kilometer zone between Russia and Ukraine, at the very least in the north of the country, and at most along the entire front line.
Putin held a meeting with his military about the need to create a buffer zone on Ukrainian territory in order to ensure Russia's security at the expense of Ukrainian land. They were talking about a possible invasion or expansion of the Russian occupation zone in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions.
But the Russian army is simply incapable of doing this. The Kremlin no longer has either the equipment or enough manpower. On average, Russian forces advance by 41 square kilometers per week. At this pace, according to analysts, it will take the Kremlin many years just to reach the borders of the regions already written into the Russian constitution. And as for capturing the area declared as a buffer zone, that would take decades.
Why is Putin saying this? What buffer zone? Along the entire border, let's be honest. The length of the border from the Russian-Ukrainian front line is about 1,600 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken, right? Well, fine, he can't even get past the miserable 5 or 10 kilometers. He's moving at a snail's pace. So how is he planning to do the same thing but over a stretch of 600 kilometers? And how many years will it take to create this buffer zone? As I understand it, you'd have to go 30 kilometers deep along the entire 1,600 kilometers of the border. It's all madness.
Military experts are convinced that the Kremlin has neither the resources nor the time for this. As a result, Putin is trying to be cunning, and instead of conquering new territories, he's started egging Trump on to make a deal with Kiev himself.
Right now, before our very eyes, Russia is essentially trying to create yet another, a 6th entity, which Russia intends to annex or take control of, to seize from Ukraine, a so-called buffer zone. Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Donetsk regions, Crimea, and now in addition the buffer zone. In effect, this is how Putin is trying to legitimize Russia's presence in these territories.
But international law would not have allowed Trump to even hint at recognizing Russia's claims to the territories it has already seized, let alone those still under Ukrainian control.
All for now. For more breaking news from the front, tune in to our next broadcast.